Hi, welcome everyone. This is the secret military history of Monsanto. We're broadcasting live on Facebook on our Millions Against Monsanto channel, as well as other channels that Organic Consumers Association uses for our various campaigns. You might be watching us on Rockfin, and we're going to do a longer broadcast on Rockfin, but we'll be here on Millions Against Monsanto for a half hour talking with Dr. Peter Breggin. Dr. Breggin is a hero of mine, and I know him from his recent work, but I recently saw a movie called The Minds of Men. And I ended up falling into finding this film because I was researching MK Ultra, the CIA's mind control. I don't want to call them experiments, let's call them crimes, because they happen to real people, and it's hardly an experiment when you're the victim and you experience it fully. It's no longer a test at that point. So I was looking into Monsanto's connection to MK Ultra, and I found the case of a man named Leonard Kyle. Now, Dr. Breggin will tell us all about this, but just to lay the groundwork here, we've got a very strong Monsanto connection to this story because there was a company called the Scientific Engineering Institute. It was a CIA front company, and that company was bought by Searle, which was run by Donald Rumsfeld, and then Donald Rumsfeld arranged the sale of Searle to Monsanto. So Monsanto ended up owning a CIA front company. And now we will turn to Dr. Peter Breggin to tell us this horrific tale. Dr. Breggin, welcome.
Well, hi. This sounds very, very interesting.
Well,
I've just learned all kinds of things in 30 seconds.
It's become one of my favorite topics. It's maybe a distraction from what's happening in our world today. Current events are a little too close for comfort, so it's become an obsession of mine to look into the early history of biological weapons, the CIA, mind control experiments, and I came across this MK Ultra Monsanto connection. Another one of the MK Ultra Monsanto connections that I found recently was to Bayer, because my audience will know Bayer and Monsanto merged in 2018. And so now we have two evil companies with two separate histories merged together. And Bayer, as many people know, has a Nazi past. And then what most people don't know is the Nazi World War II history merges with US military history. There's a situation called Operation Paperclip.
Yeah.
A bunch of
You're breaking up. I can't hear you. I don't hear anything anymore.
Looks like her computer is frozen. I'll see if I can get her back on. Do you have an idea of what she was leading to ask you about there?
No, actually, I don't understand the connection to the psychosurgery, but I could ask her that. But I actually, it's fascinating, but I don't know where it connects to the psychiatry and psychosurgery stuff. And she's obviously got a connection.
Hopefully she'll be right back on here. Maybe tell us a little bit about your background.
Oh, sure, for the show.
Hi, sorry about that. Every time I get into a good topic and a good conversation on Rockfin, something odd happens to my computer. So, so I've joined by phone. So I don't know if you heard a story about Bayer's connection to MK Ultra, the CIA being run out of the IG Farben building in Frankfurt.
No. But what I'm not clear with is at what point does this intersect with psychosurgery, which does have deep state connections. It was being supported by the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was doesn't exist now, is the DARPA of the Justice Department. They were funding psychosurgery. And it connects to the Congress actually gave money directly to the National Institute of Mental Health, and there is no provision in the law or the Constitution for that. And then NIMH, without having any evaluation of the project, gave the money to the psychosurgeons in Boston. There was a group of psychosurgeons in Boston who were among the most powerful people in the nation. At the time I was taking them on, I was 3 or 4 years, 5 years out of my residency. And I was in private practice.
Wow.
And I found out lobotomy was coming back. And I had purposely not continued an early career at the National Institute of Mental Health. I had finished my residency, which included a year at Harvard. And I had realized at Harvard in particular that psychiatry had completely sold out to the drug companies. And that was 1963-4.
Wow.
And in psychiatry, the top is the worst. If you're going to go to a psychiatrist, the higher up you go, the more famous he is, the more Hollywood clients or whatever he has, the more likely he is to be deeply tied in some way to the drug companies.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
certainly to conventional psychiatry, which is the drug companies. And Harvard had tied itself in deeply to the drug companies. And I knew the people at Harvard already because I'd gone to Harvard College and I'd run a giant volunteer program. And a lot of my viewpoint, by the way, comes from the fact that I was trained by my own eyes rather than by the profession, by my own experience, because I was planning to be either a professor of history or a lawyer. I was in an honors program at Harvard on American history and literature. And a friend invites me out to a state mental hospital. So maybe this beginning will make tie-ins that you haven't imagined between some of what I've been doing and what you're doing. And so I go out to the state mental hospital to volunteer. And the whole experience of the first day on the violent women's ward, it was supposedly the violent women's ward, locked, like a dungeon. And it reminded me of my Uncle Dutch's description of liberating a extermination camp.
Wow.
The stench, the awful condition of the people, the callousness of everybody involved in the project. And I had also seen concentration camp films inadvertently when I was 9 years old. I was in a movie for a family show and it came on Movie Tone News. So I had these indelible images in me. It's as if God set it up. And I walk into this place. It looks like a concentration or extermination center. So I ended up working there for 4 years. I ran the program. We actually wrote a book about the program. I used to give lectures to conferences of physicians on volunteers and how much we could help people. And we really showed that we were doing better than the hospital was. The hospital was harming people, is what I discovered. But we were actually helping patients leave the hospital, and we got written up as amazing help for the state mental hospitals. And at that point, it was really coming to an end where psychiatry would even accept volunteers as meaningful, because pretty soon psychiatry would be saying everything's biologic. They need drugs, shock treatment, and lobotomy.
Right.
And you can't talk to schizophrenia. It was the kind of things they begin to say very, very soon. And that's how I went into psychiatry. I went in as a successful reformer.
Yes.
That's why I went to medical school. I wasn't going to go to medical school. And
You went into medical school with the mission of being a reformer of the profession.
Exactly.
That is beautiful.
It's a really, no one's quite ever said it to me that exactly that way, but that was absolutely what it was. And in fact, I had a talk with my father. My father was hardly ever said anything, and we really didn't have many conversations. And I called him on the phone from school, and I said, Dad, I really want to go into this field and work with, do what I've been doing in the mental hospitals and make things better and help change the field. I could go to graduate school in psychology. There were even social workers doing this work, and he was paying for my education. And he said to me, well, who has the strongest trade union?
Oh, good question.
I said, oh, there's no question, Dad. It's the medical psychiatry people. He said, okay, well, all right, good. I'll support you for that.
Hmm.
And I could have gone in different directions. And I think so much of it's God's hand, because medical school was not a direction I'd gone into, planned to. I had to change my entire curriculum.
Yes.
I had to
catching up to do.
I started to take pre-med courses, I think, in the summer of my sophomore year or something. But I did all this work, so I got into good medical schools. I've been doing this amazing work that people were familiar with. But when I got to Harvard, now I'm in the Harvard training program as a resident and a teaching fellow at Harvard Medical School, and the drug companies have taken over. And that was the beginning of my thoroughly realizing that things had changed.
Mm-hmm.
But I had a good record, and I went to the National Institute of Mental Health, NIH, where Anthony Fauci was actually entering NIH in about a year after me. I'm fond of saying it. He probably was 2 years behind me. And when he got to NIH, he had to see that the drug companies were taking over. And obviously he rubbed his hands together and said, this looks terrific. And I looked at it and I got invited to stay, and I initially agreed. And then I said, no, I can't. This is all going to be about the drugs. I mean, I see all this unfolding in front of my eyes. And I went to private practice feeling guilty because I loved just seeing patients, but I thought I was supposed to be reforming psychiatry. And then I found out that lobotomy was coming back. And I decided somebody had to take a stand. Somebody had to say, we will not again mutilate the brains of people. We won't put knives in their skulls and swish them around. We won't stick electrodes in and melt pieces of their brain, or put in a funnel and pour poison in. All these things that were done. Planting radium pellets. I mean, these terrible things being done to people. So I got deeply involved in that, which could be a very long show. So I'll skip over all the early involvement. But especially interesting for your guests, I think, was that the Harvard program had started a psychosurgery program at the Mass General, and they couldn't get it by the Scientific Review Committee.
Well, good.
I mean, that was amazing. That's probably the only time I've heard of anything like that, where a seriously damaging program couldn't get by the psychiatric, at least, scientific committees. And they farmed the surgery out to Boston City. But the head of the whole idea was William Sweet, who was arguably the most powerful man in American medicine. He was the head of neurosurgery at Harvard. And I started to investigate. I just started to look hard at things. And I found out they had set up their own private foundation just for themselves, and that they had gotten money from the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was like the DARPA arm of the Justice Department. And the way I found out was the way I had a couple of momentous events when I'd look in my mail and there'd be a big brown envelope with no return address on it. And there would be documents in it. And that's how I got the DARPA program working with William Sweet.
Wow.
Never found out the origin of it.
Wow.
Later, I would get a similar brown envelope with the pieces of the medical records of the Kennedy who had been lobotomized and nobody knew about it. God, it's been so long since I talked about these old issues. I think she was Rosemary.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. JFK,
And
RFK, Ted Kennedy's sister, Rosemary. Yeah.
And nobody had heard about this. And it was very valuable for me to have it because all of a sudden Kennedy wasn't getting in my way as much when I had this material. Because he was head of the health committee and he wanted to stop everything I was doing on psychosurgery.
He would have wanted to protect his constituents at
his family. It's family.
Family, yeah, that makes sense too.
Nobody knew about the lobotomies on Rosemary. So this is all these interesting things, but and they also, as I think I was starting to say, they had funding directly from the Congress that was ordered to NIMH to give to them without any vetting of it, because they lost when they were vetted at Harvard.
Yeah.
And they wrote a book called Violence in the Brain. The introduction is by this elder statesman, William Sweet, and then a psychiatrist named Irvin and a neurosurgeon named Mark and Irvin wrote the book. And in it, they described a young man, Leonard Kyle, his name turns out to be. It was, I think, Leonard K. in the book. They also, yep.
Thomas R. They used.
He's also Thomas R. That's what I was going to say. And they described Thomas as a violent man who had been hospitalized. He couldn't be treated. They did surgery on him, and he was cured. And what I discovered along the way is that they had actually marched him up and down the ward under the direction of a real kind of globalist predator character, Jose Delgado, who believed that he was from Spain and he was at Yale at the time, though my work forced him to go home. I think students protested.
Wow.
But he had been, he'd written a book, Physical Control of the Mind, about how people didn't have free will, so we might as well admit it and go ahead and tamper with their brains. That he even mentions that the things like Constitution and so on were nonsense. Very similar to everything we have in the world today. And he was way ahead of his time. And I discovered along the way that they'd gotten consent from Leonard, supposed consent, by changing him by managing to manipulate the electrodes, so he went from being terrified of the surgery and saying, "Let me go," to being euphoric and saying, "Okay."
So after they had put electrodes in his brain, then they got him to sign a consent form.
Isn't that bizarre? Now, this was written up in the scientific literature.
Wait, that was included in the publications about his case?
Yeah, it was in the literature. And
wow.
I couldn't believe that nobody else has been upset about any of this.
Right.
This has been my career, I can't believe what I'm saying.
Right.
And there were lots of other things that were in the literature, but you had to do a little work to put them together to create the picture. So I'm doing this, and I get a letter from Leonard's mother. And she said, one of my relatives called from Boston. You've been on TV there, and you've been on the radio, and you've been talking about Thomas R. And she said, "It's my son, Leonard."
Wow.
They might as well have killed him.
Oh, my.
And she calls him a vegetable in the letter. They turned him in from a normal man into a vegetable. And I went to see him, and it was one of the most tragic experiences of my life in many, many different ways. One way was just to see him. He was lying in bed. He had newspapers over his head. He was temporarily on weekend leave from the Veterans Hospital. He was a chronic mental patient, which they said he was cured. He was a chronic mental patient forever after.
Mm.
And he was, by the way, I mean, I'm naming names here, and so it's true.
Oh, yeah. It's well done.
I've been naming their names and from the very, very beginning and writing about this stuff. He must have been at Mass General in the very beginning. He must have been there when they canceled it from the scientific committee. And he thought he was still at the Mass General, and they had manipulated his brain and they'd killed him, and yet they'd given him this highest IQ in the world, and this was just fragments that he would speak, and he couldn't talk to you. You'd kind of stimulate him with a thought or something, and then he'd go into fragments. And then I got more and more material, and he actually had never been seriously violent, never.
Yeah.
The one thing that we could find, which was hardly even in the records, was that his wife had actually, I don't know, talking about stuff on the air. He was paranoid about his wife, she said. It wasn't paranoia.
Right.
And she sent him to her psychiatrist, who sent him to Mark Irvin's suite. At the time, he was working as an engineer. He had patents. He had had one angry encounter on a road. One time he got in an argument with another driver or something. No fighting. And once he had, in anger, in his paranoid anger, he'd thrown a closed can of soup or something at his wife, which is, of course, a very bad thing to do, but it's not something you destroy a man's brain over. And didn't hit her. On the wards, he was entirely normal in his evaluation. Basically, EEG was normal and things like that. And they used the VA to pay for his workup for the psychosurgery, basically. And then when he went to Boston City Hospital, they told him that everything was going to become good, that it was to be good for him and his family and his wife and everything. And when he was on the wards, she divorced him. And the Frank Irvin, when he tried to leave the ward, he was not an involuntary patient. He was not formally, he was not under the law involuntary. They took his pants away from him. If he wanted to leave, they'd just take his clothes away from him. I managed to cut off all their funding.
Wow.
And to stop all their surgery before I was done. And I did that with every major project in the U.S.
Wow.
It was amazing. And it was really just me and anybody else who would work with me. Feminists worked with me because most of the patients were women. And it was my first experience of working very, very closely with the Black Caucus, because Mark and Irvin, and here's this political thing, Mark Irvin and Sweet were claiming that ghetto rioters had brain damage that they could fix with their psychosurgery. And Sweet had testified about this. And nobody ever did anything about it. They even had an article in JAMA about it. And they had a big story in, I think it was Life magazine, one of the top magazines about it. And there was nobody had ever protested. Even the racist remarks in JAMA. See, everybody was afraid of the riots back in the 60s. And there were famous people who were actually political. I don't agree with their politics, but these young men that were leading the Black insurgency were political. They were not mentally ill.
Right.
And they were going to declare them brain damage, not just mentally ill, but brain damage. and nobody did anything about it. Then I found out that along the way they were operating on little black children in Jackson, Mississippi,
Mm.
and I found out the guy didn't mention their race in all the articles. It's the first thing you mention. You always say age, sex, race. In any research project, that was the first thing. And when I noticed that he was operating on children as young as like 5,
Ugh.
I looked at that and I said, "What's their race? Why is no race mentioned here?"
Mm.
And I called down. I got a civil rights African American down in Jackson, and this is not Ole Miss. This is the University of Mississippi.
Okay.
And I asked him about it, and he said, "Oh, that we know their race. That's a segregated facility."
Mm.
And he said, "Oh, I'm going to go in there. I'm going to find a way. Have some lunch. I'll meet some nurses." And he came back with, that there were nurses that were appalled, little children walking around their wards with electrodes like ponytails coming out of their heads for interminably. He'd come by with his ambulance, and they would bring the kids to the hospital where he'd operate. And this was the first time ever and only that I had the cooperation of another establishment psychiatrist. So there were some rebel guys, but I called down to the university and I asked to talk to the psychiatrist, to the chief psychiatrist. I told him I was a young doctor. I'm on the staff at the Washington School of Psychiatry, which was a pretty well-known place. And he got on the phone with me and I said, "I'm calling down about a neurosurgeon, O.J. Andy." And he said, "Oh, yeah, he's right down the hall from me." I said, "He's operating on little children. They're black kids in the segregated institution, putting electrodes in his heads." And he said, "Oh, my God." He said, "Oh, God, no." I said, "Yes, sir. I'll send you all the data. I'll send you his publications." And he said, "Thank you." I never heard from him again. He set up a committee to monitor O.J. Andy, this guy's name, he's gone, to monitor his surgery, and he couldn't get past the committee because, of course, so atrocious.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the first places that my interventions just stopped things flat. But that happened in different ways, but never again with help from within an institution that I knew of.
Wow.
It was always pressure, people picketing, threats of lawsuits, and things like that. And I testified in a bunch of lawsuits. It was very hard to win a case in Boston against a famous Harvard doctors.
Wow, I bet.
But it was very, very hard. And it was very dangerous. I mean, they would do anything they could. Not as dangerous as Eli Lilly and the Prozac people when they took on Prozac. Not even close.
Well,
as far as I know. But so before it was all over, I had gotten an education in, first of all, disillusionment with my profession of medicine and psychiatry on a level that was unimaginable, that I was the only person to ever publicly take on lobotomy in its entire history. I was the first psychiatrist to testify against anybody and to win a lawsuit against anybody on psychosurgery. And it was like a mystery to me. And when we talk later about other things, we'll see these modern mysteries about how is it that nobody's done this before? How is it nobody stands up on these big issues?
mm-hmm.
And I think it has so much to do with that when you get high up in a profession, your identity becomes so defined. You are a neurosurgeon. You are a psychiatrist. You are approved by the boards. You are this, you are that. And any threat to it is so profound that you can't even consider or think about criticizing your colleagues or criticizing what they're doing. I think it's fundamentally about that.
Yeah.
And in many cases, it's also about that you participated in some way. If you're a psychiatrist, you've given shock treatment. It's almost impossible not to in your training.
Mm.
You make a choice at some point of being fired or not.
Wow.
And that was, that was the toughest decision I ever made, was that I participated in giving shock treatment rather than lose my residency so I couldn't fight them. I would have no credibility to fight them. So I did, and I later apologized in writing and talked about how it was the shame of my life, that I just made a conscious choice. I had a friend who was in the same residency program, and he decided not to. And they fired him, and he never became a psychiatrist even. So also the involvement with the federal government blew me away, with the Justice Department. They've always wanted to weaponize psychiatry. Electroshock was also supported by the federal government, the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
In Canada, Cameron, you may even know about that. They got big studies. They were not studies; they were tortures.
Yeah.
In Canada, where they took women and gave them so much electroshock that it destroyed their personalities, and then they would try to reprogram them to fit their husband's needs. It's practically that bad. Maybe a little more subtle, but the husband was the well one, the wife was the sick one.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, she got shocked, not him. And from that came the wonderful opportunity to just talk with the husband about what he would like and things like that. And there was even a psychiatrist who published an article in a free drug handout by a major corporate company about reprogramming women for their husbands.
Wow.
Nobody ever said anything about it. And they had to, that kind of thing goes to tens of thousands, God knows how many people, because it was a publication of a drug company.
Oh my gosh. The Stepford wives are real. Oh my God.
And
so horrifying.
And I noticed that, every place that I do work, every area I go into, so many people have to come to grips with what I came to grips with so young, maybe by watching being 9 or 10 years old and watching the Nazi extermination camps, or talking to my Uncle Dutch about them. People cannot believe that human beings would do these things. And even if they say them openly, they don't seem to, it doesn't register. That evil doesn't register.
Yep.
You see that? You do see that yourself in your work? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, I think it's hard for all of us to let these things sink in. And when you do, then you have responsibility to make a change and speak out. And so it's a heavy load to take on, to admit the wrongs, because then you have to make the rights.
Yeah. And I think this is a good thing to just talk about generically with your audience, and that we have to make throughout our lives. Obviously we make different choices. I mean, I've chosen not to get involved with the child sex slavery issues because I want to do that my next lifetime. Right now I got my hands full. So we make choices. And I work regularly with all the time with my wife Ginger, who is a co-author of a book that we can talk about later in the segment. And we still have trouble coming to grips with the evil of individuals and of institutions, and how they will consciously perform evil. And where I became most involved with that in psychiatry, No, it wasn't. No, the most involvement was probably walking into the state mental hospital and facing that evil, and then the evil of the children in Jackson, Mississippi, with the electrodes in their heads, having their heads burned. I mean, those were probably seminal experiences.
Mm.
But the disillusion with the whole profession and even the legal system really set in when I was asked to become the single scientific expert who would do what's called discovery for all the 150 or so lawsuits against Eli Lilly for Prozac.
Oh, wow.
And the Prozac, the cases were about murder, violence, alleged murder, alleged violence, alleged psychosis caused by Prozac.
Wow.
And I was literally the person in the world standing up against this new wave of drugs, the drugs that made the first antidepressant blockbusters and so on.
Mm-hmm.
That was my job. And it was really quite astonishing to see the cover-ups within the company. I've written a whole book about it, talking back to Prozac. It's still available with Ginger Ross Breggin, my co-author. I'm working on my own until about 1984 when Ginger and I got together and got married. And from then on, my work and Ginger's are literally indistinguishable because everything I do, she does with me and helps with me. And she's co-authored several of the books, and we're the war room together. Doesn't matter what we're doing. We could be eating dinner out. We're the war room. And she's always been she was a major reformer at the age of about 12. She went in. She took some kittens to her local animal shelter. Her mom took her, and it was a horror.
Mm.
And she decided that she was going to do something about it. By the time she was 16, they'd torn it down and set up new plans, and she was the only non-physician, non-veterinarian on the planning committee for the new shelter.
Oh.
In order to do this, she joined the campaign for the mayoralty campaign on the side of the animal shelter man, who thought that she had a fabulous cause, and won the mayoralty campaign.
That's great.
Oh God. So you can imagine what our conversations are like.
Yeah.
But I think it's so important to just remind people that there is all of your audience, and your audience can be as good as anyone to already know this, that there really is evil.
Yeah.
And the evil in people is actually beyond imagination. I mean, who can imagine, I guess the guy in Chicago, who would actually do lobotomies on these kids he would capture. What the heck was his name? Do you remember him?
No, I haven't heard of.
Yeah, I'm just not describing him very well. It didn't come out very much. See, they didn't want to talk about us doing lobotomies because he was doing exactly what the surgeons were doing. He'd go and he'd damage the young man's brain.
Oh gosh.
And then he'd be docile, completely docile. This is a horrible show. You think people are going to turn this off? Can we brighten it up in some way? I haven't talked about these issues very, very much at all in a very long time because I'm doing a lot of other things that will come up on another of your shows, however you want to say it. But we gotta face it that on an individual and institutional level, there is no limit to the horrors will be perpetrated. I mean, if you look at what Hitler did and what Stalin did, and just in my lifetime, and Mao did, I mean, between the three of them, they probably murdered 200 million civilians, non-combatants, to get rid of the political opposition, to make people docile, to um, defeat the ideologically impure and so on and so forth, make space for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So the other side of it that let me talk about briefly, which is that it's wonderful to be a reformer.
Yeah.
I look at you and Alexis, and you're clearly a happy human being. It sounds like it, looks like it. You look like a very full human being. And when you do this work, you do meet wonderful people.
Mm-hmm.
You meet incredible people whom you didn't know people could be so good.
Yeah. So
You have that experience.
Oh, all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And it makes for a wonderful, wonderful life.
Mm-hmm.
And you get very loved, and you love other people, and there's a camaraderie and a shared fear. At least in the work I do, we have to all be afraid, um, and you have that to share, and being brave in the face of it. When you start working on the edges that are scary, um, it's exciting, it's scary, and it's wonderful because of the profound relationships you make.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a good thing. You might even get on Alex's show.
Well, much fun, Breggin. We're going to close out this segment of our conversation, but if you are watching on Rockfin, just stay where you are. And if you're watching on Facebook on Millions Against Monsanto or on another social media channel, you can switch and join us on Rockfin. So we've been talking with Dr. Peter Breggin. He's a psychiatrist who has spent his entire career trying to reform psychiatry, starting with the most horrifying cases, the cases of involuntary brain surgery. And as I learned about Dr. Breggin's work, I discovered a connection between Monsanto and this involuntary brain surgery, because the CIA front group, the Scientific Engineering Institute, that was funding CIA doctors to commit involuntary brain surgery on people like Leonard Kyle, that corporation ended up being bought by Searle, which then was bought by Monsanto, which is then bought by Bayer, bringing it full circle to the Nazi doctors of the Holocaust, because Bayer was an IG Farben corporation. And when the CIA started its MK Ultra program, they did so with Nazi doctors, Nazi spies, and they did it in Germany. They were based out of the IG Farben building in Frankfurt when the CIA began its MK Ultra work, which then led to situations like Leonard Kyle's, where he was given involuntary brain surgery. He had electrodes implanted into his brain. And this is a story that I heard, Dr. Breggin. You can tell me if this is apocryphal or not, but I read that Leonard Kyle, his situation is why we know the term tinfoil hat. Is that true?
No, I suspect that came earlier. When I talked about the case, it was always about him lying down with these newspapers over his head, and having a couple of days at home from the VA. And by the way, those doctors knew this whole story and still wrote about him as a complete cure with no adverse effects.
Yeah, they thought that they could cover the truth and get away with it. Yeah.
Because too few of us who can overcome the horror and the fear associated with taking on these kind of people. But it's a good life when you do it. I'm 86 years old.
Congratulations.
I think I've been kept alive by God because there's so few other people doing what I do. I have never said that publicly before.
I believe it's true. I believe that's true. That's a beautiful thing.